Leary from County Galway. She's made a home in Connecticut. We won't hold that against her. For the last 3 decades. A seasoned educator, she has taught language arts at the elementary and middle school levels in Darien, Connecticut, New Canaan, Norwalk, and Stamford. That's different demographics there, right? A freelance journalist, her writing has appeared in publications such as the Irish Echo, Irish Central, Irish Examiner, and Australia's Irish Scene. Currently, Loretto serves as the Educational and Cultural Director of Ireland's Great Hunger Museum of Fairfield and is co-chair of the Connecticut Ireland Trade Commission. Loretto is pursuing her PhD at Trinity College Dublin, where her research focuses on Irish American famine memory and the memorial landscapes of New York, with particular attention to Staten Island's role in the transatlantic story of loss, survival, and remembrance. So here is Loretto to tell us that story.
That's good. Thank you very, very much. Cúpla focal as Gaeilge. Dia Díomha Cordia is Misha Loretto Leary agus tá áthas orm an rud tafahach seo a chuirí láthair. Is cuid tafahach seo I ddíú stórn an gcuirta mór tág tá déanta orthaí agus tá súlagam go bhain sibh tetanach as an fólam anocht. Hello everyone, my name is Loretto and I'm delighted to see that there are people interested in this topic. It's very important. It's little researched and little known part of Irish famine history, and I hope you enjoy it. And thank you for coming out on a cold night. And I'd like to thank Jim and also Maureen for videoing, and Marie for getting me here safely in her car. Okay. So I'll begin by telling you that as part of the Irish Great Hunger Museum of Fairfield, I also do presentations about the Irish in Connecticut, and my PhD studies is now going beyond Connecticut, so it'll bring in Rhode Island, Maine, and all of the burial sites on the eastern seaboard where marginalised communities like the famine Irish immigrants are buried. So, slide 1. For the thousands of Irish immigrants who left Ireland during the years of the Great Hunger, America was a land of hope. For many, those hopes were dashed when their ships reached port and they were quarantined on Staten Island. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This presentation is organised into 6 sections: before and during the famine, the Irish question, politics and the arrival of blight, the famine immigrants' journey, the arrival at Staten Island Marine Hospital and Quarantine Station, the treatment of Irish famine immigrants in quarantine, the destruction of the quarantine, and what remains today. I have to be fair to the locals on Staten Island, because if I stopped at the destruction of the quarantine, it would be unfair not to show the 3 sides of the story. So we have to do that. All right. Ireland's economy was fragile before the famine, with only 2.25% of the population employed in industries such as linen production and weaving, while over 97% relied on agriculture. By 1845, Ireland had an average population density of 217 people per square mile, with the province of Connacht, the west of Ireland, having a higher density of over 386 per square mile. Irish soldiers before the famine had participated in the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815, and there was growing resentment in Ireland that their sacrifices meant nothing. When wartime economic boom faded, an economic crisis hit and impacted all of Europe, leading up to the famine. Irish labourers were among the lowest paid workers in Europe. The practice of landlordism, akin to a Ponzi scheme, that's the best way I can describe it, exacerbated the economic crisis, and consequently ordinary people's debts were increasing and rents also continued to rise. In England, the Irish question transitioned from fear of a French or Spanish invasion before the famine to dealing with an impoverished and beggarly nation after it. Daniel O'Connell was known as the Liberator. I'm sure you all recognise him. He played a significant role in securing Catholic emancipation in 1829, allowing Catholics to join the British Parliament. He also fought to repeal the Act of Union in 1801 and restore the Irish Parliament. This was known as Home Rule later. The image depicts the Repeal Association's Conciliation Hall in Dublin, which was built in 1841, just 4 years before the Blight arrived. And this is where O'Connell would engage in political debates with other political leaders, such as. So, in the middle of, or leading up to the famine, there was a fracture in Irish politics, a divide. Conciliation Hall served as a hub for debates on repealing the Act of Union. And the Repeal Association, led by O'Connell, promoted peaceful methods to restore an Irish Parliament, and frustrated with O'Connell's belief in non-violence, a group known as the Irish Confederation, that's what they called themselves, emerged. O'Connell referred to this group negatively as Young Ireland, and the Young Irelanders walked out of Conciliation Hall during a debate with O'Connell on July the 28th, 1846, so just a few months into the famine, and it signalled a split in the peaceful methods of O'Connell's Home Rule agitation. O'Connell passed away on May the 15th, 1847 in Italy. The Young Irelanders, as they became known, were well-educated young men, editors, journalists, lawyers, doctors and landowners, men like Thomas Davis, who gave us a nation once again, Charles Gavin Duffy, John Mitchell, and of course their leader William Smith O'Brien. They all advocated for more radical action. And the most radical of them all was the firebrand John Mitchell, who was from the north of Ireland. Thomas Davis, author of A Nation once again, he died on the eve of famine in 1845, on the 16th of September, and he was only 30 years old. The creator of the Irish tricolour is Thomas Francis Maher, a man born in Waterford, and he died in 1867 after falling off the back of a steamboat into the Missouri River. There's some great books about these men, and it was actually because of the Young Irelanders when I was 17 years of age, and the simple question of why would you throw a rebellion in the middle of a famine when people are starving? That simple question sent me down a rabbit hole for over 40 years now. So William Smith O'Brien, we have a cartoon in, I think it's Punch magazine. It's making fun of the political division in Ireland. William Smith O'Brien, the cat on the left in this cartoon, ridiculing politicians, was a prominent leader of the Young Ireland movement, championing Irish nationalism and independence. Initially a supporter of the Anglo-Irish Union, Smith O'Brien later joined the Repeal Association to oppose British rule. And in 1848, he led the unsuccessful rebellion starting in Ballingarry, County Tipperary. Resulting in his arrest and conviction for high treason, his death sentence was commuted to exile in Van Diemen's Land, which we call Tasmania today. He remained there until his full pardon in 1856, and the Young Ireland Rebellion became a defining moment for Irish nationalists. I always look at rebellions as like a domino effect, and I'll address that more later. So now we have the arrival of blight. Just 3 days before Thomas Davis died of scarlatina, scarlet fever, the Gardener's Chronicle and the Cultural Gazette announced the arrival of blight on September the 13th, 1845, marking the beginning of a period in Irish history now referred to as the Irish Famine or the Great Hunger. The fungus Phytophthora infestans spread throughout Ireland, causing consecutive potato crop failures over the next several years, forcing over 2 million people to emigrate and resulting in over 1 million deaths between 1845 and 1852. The population in Ireland in 1845 was 8 million. Today it is 5.3, so we have not recovered to the original population. Between 30 to 40% of those 8 million people in 1845 survived on one single crop, the lumper potato. An average of almost 3 million people survive on this one crop. So remember what I said, that over 97% of the population in Ireland were in agriculture, and then a further majority survived on one crop. Why did Irish farmers rely on one crop, tenant farmers specifically? Landlords charged high rents for farmland, forcing Irish farmers to use the best land for crops like wheat and corn, which they then sold to pay their own rent. As a result, those tenant farmers were left with only small plots for growing their own food. Many had just a quarter of an acre. Potatoes were ideal to grow in small spots since they needed little space to yield big harvests. They were nutritious and grew well in poor soil and poor climates. On an acre, 1 acre of potatoes could feed a family of 4 for 1 year, and a grown man in Ireland at this time could eat up to 14 pounds of potatoes per day. There is some research coming out now that up until the famine, the Irish were actually the tallest people, considered to be the tallest people in Europe. And now epigenetics is showing that it takes 3 generations for the effects of famine to show up in your cells. And as you can see, I'm a fine tall woman. The Irish are actually quite a short race now because of that, so the research claims. And the Blight's rapid and widespread destruction of the potato crop began with visible damage in the leaves, and then led to the swift decay of sweet, seemingly healthy potatoes already in storage. So many hungry people resorted to eating the diseased potatoes, which only made them even more sick. There are reports of healthy potatoes during the famine being exported in the years of the famine on the ports and then rotting on the ports. There are accounts of people driving or riding in a carriage from Dublin to the west of Ireland, and they can actually smell the rot in the air. Now, the people who lived through this period did not call it the Irish famine, and most people will tell you it was not a famine, because famine means there was no food in the country. There was indeed plenty of food in the country. It was being shipped abroad, exported. The people who lived through this time period would have called it an druch sale, the bad times, or an gorta mór, the great hunger. And how bad were those bad times? When James Mahoney did these sketches for the Illustrated London News in 1847, the Irish had resorted to picking through the fields for diseased potatoes, begging, eating wildlife, and even worse. Environmentalists today say that certain species of birds and animals were brought to the brink of extinction during the later years of the Great Hunger. Things became so bad in Black 1847, with further famines in 1848 and 1849, that people were reduced to eating putrid pigs, donkeys, and dogs. But the situation was going to become worse. We know of court cases involving survivor cannibalism in Cork, Kerry, Galway, and Mayo. And these are the people that anti-Irish cartoonists in England and America were making fun of during the Great Hunger. And here's one of those cartoons. It's actually, I think, a great one to teach what propaganda is. This is a Nat cartoon in 1848. Look at that year. It's the same year that the Young Ireland Rebellion happened. And we've just gone through 1847, considered Black 47, because it has the highest mortality rates of the years of the Great Hunger. So it's 1848, and even though Ireland is still starving, cartoons about the Irish and hunger were still being printed, perpetuating anti-Irish sentiments in England and America. The Great Hunger for some was a laughing matter. So what I like to use this one is, it's making fun of impoverished people, it's making fun of sick people, it's making fun of the Irish accent. Well, Pat, how's the influenza? Do you expect to rate? Expect to eat? How the devil should I expect to eat without a sexpence in my pocket? During the Irish famine, Queen Victoria's involvement in relief efforts were fairly limited. She made a personal donation of £2,000 sterling to aid the cause, which many critics felt was insufficient given the scale of the suffering. Charles Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury, oversaw the government's response during the famine. Trevelyan was misguided by two principles of belief: providentialism and the Malthusian ideology of laissez-faire economics. Both actually kind of went hand in hand. The idea was let the markets be as they will and let God do his will. So Trevelyan believed that too much government aid would create Irish dependency on Britain, and the potato crop failure was God's will. God sent the blight to punish the lazy Irish, and the markets would self-correct eventually. These misguided principles led to inadequate government responses. The government set up public work programs, providing desperate Irish men and women with jobs in exchange for very low wages. The wages were insufficient to keep up with skyrocketing food and rent prices. The work was grueling and ineffective as a long-term solution for these malnourished people who were growing weaker by the day. Workhouses, intended to offer refuge to the poor, quickly became overwhelmed. They were overcrowded, unsanitary, and rife with disease, and the National Day of Fast and Humiliation for the Irish Famine was observed on March 1847, March 24th, and it was observed across the United Kingdom by royal proclamation. I've read some of these sermons that were given in Church of England parishes in Ireland and England at the time, and they're just an eye-opener. Some people were very good and they had good intentions, but because of that misguided belief of providentialism that God was punishing the Irish and that was God's will, it just exacerbated the problem. So one day of fasting on March the 24th to atone for the Irish. Work was halted, special services were held at places of worship, and collections were made for famine relief in Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. British policies continue to prioritise food exports from Ireland. A gold star for a guess where the most of the money went on that collection day: to the Scottish Highlands. So if I'll be writing something shortly. There's actually a ledger in Burns Library in Boston that I saw this summer, and it actually details what the parishes gave in Ireland. So it's a fascinating look. My father's mother was from Neenah in County Tipperary, and they actually did, the Church of Ireland in Neenah did give, but so did their servants, to this National Fast Day. What I will add about the workhouses too is that when you put people who are sick and malnourished and have compromised immune systems at this point, who have diseases, into a workhouse and overcrowd them, it becomes an incubator for diseases. So they're dying in the workhouses, they're dying on the side of the road, because when the idea of the workhouse is it can't be better than life outside the workhouse. You can't make it like a hotel. So how can it be worse than the exterior, and people to survive that adequately? Sorry. So this is the Young Ireland Rebellion. Fearing another crop failure for the fall harvest of 1848, the Young Ireland Rebellion began on July the 29th, 1848, but it was short-lived. Skirmishes erupted around Ireland, and on that same day, a few Young Irelanders attempted to seize a police barracks in South Tipperary, Ballingarry, South Tipperary. The police retreated to a house, the widow McCormick's house, also in Ballingarry, where they held, the police, I'll say that again, held 5 children hostage. The widow's 5 children were held inside by the police as hostages. A confrontation ensued and 1 man was killed. The photo is my own, taken in 2019 at that same house. It is now called the War House, and it's a museum dedicated to that Young Ireland Rebellion. And it's a fine house. It's actually, I mean, the illustration shows there were fine structures in Ireland. We weren't all living in cottages. And this is important. So, this man here is James Stephens. Does anybody know who James Stephens is? No. So the rebellion's leader, the Young Ireland Rebellion leader, William Smith O'Brien, was arrested along with others after a 3-day standoff. He was ridiculed in the press. It was ridiculed in the press as the Battle of Widow McCormick's Cabbage Patch. The Young Ireland Rebellion was successful only in drawing public attention when the court-martials of the leaders and their initial sentencing of death was commuted to transportation for life to Van Diemen's Land. Did the percentage of immigration rise after the rebellion? The rebellion created a sense of political and social turmoil in Ireland, which fueled covert escapes and a peak in immigration in 1851. So it took people a while, ordinary people, it took them a while after that rebellion. There was very strict laws put back into place. The Irish couldn't have guns. It was very harsh laws. So they started to, the rebellion participants started to escape covertly. Some of them were dressed as priests, actually there is an account of one man who did quite well for himself in Darien, Connecticut. He escaped after the failed rebellion, a Waterford man, in a coffin, allegedly. The harvest in 1855 only gave half of what yielded half of 1844. So that continued lack of food and those harsh laws after the 1848 rebellion made the Irish leave in droves. That man there is James Stephens, and he is considered the father of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which later became known as, there you go. And he's important because, you know, it's told that that shot that killed one man at the Widow McCormick's house, that the man that was killed died by mistake, that the bullet was meant for the leader of the rebellion, William Smith O'Brien, but that he pulled him out of the way. James Stephens saved William O'Brien's life, but another man died on that day. So the famine immigrants' journey, I'm sorry, am I skipping one here? So that's the political climate in Ireland. You also have one of the worst winters and the highest amounts of snowfalls in the west and the north, causing even more hardship to ordinary people, who by this time have either been evicted or are living in what they call scalps or lean-tos on the side of the road, are taking time to, or having family gather money to have them emigrate, or assisted by the local landlord as well to emigrate. Assisted immigration was quite a large thing. So let's take a journey back in time now to an Irish port in 1847, known as Black 47, because it's believed that that year had the highest amount of deaths during the famine. We're on the Keys, be it in Dublin, Cove, Galway, or any port in Ireland or England, because Liverpool, of course, was also considered a famine port. Ships left regularly from Liverpool. Now, this illustration depicts post-famine immigration, but the scene would have been similar. Maybe the clothing might have changed, but given the fact that the majority of Irish immigrants were forced to emigrate, their clothes would have been older and hand-me-downs, not the height of fashion. Some people will have walked for days or even weeks to get to their port of departure, and some will have already taken a boat from Ireland to Liverpool to wait there for their ship to Canada or America. Imagine the noise, the hustle and bustle as you wait to leave port. You have food, you are hungry. You can't eat this food because you have to ration it for the journey. You're exposed to all kinds of weather as you wait on the dockside for the ship to leave. You've never been on a ship before. You can't swim. You're already malnourished and weak from a lack of proper food. What happens if your ship is delayed? I always mention that it's not the height of fashion for two reasons. Number one, a lot of these immigrants arrived ill-equipped to deal with the bad weather in America, especially New York and Boston. And there are newspaper accounts of families being taken in to dress warmer. And also there are accounts of women out picking potatoes in the fields before the famine in ball gowns that are 50 years old. and that the Irish farmers wore high French collared jackets that are also over 50 years old. So very, very poor people dressing, not the right way to do field work and farm work. Here are a few interior photos of replicas of famine ships in Ireland, and the first photo is a staged interior of a famine ship at the Cove Heritage Centre in County Cork, and it's a wonderful place to go visit. The man bent over, holding his head, doesn't feel too well. Maybe he's coming down with typhus, spread by an infected body louse and contracted through skin lesions. Now look at the sleeping situation in the second photo and consider how quickly disease spread on these famine ships. You're sleeping beside strangers. Your 6 weeks. 6 weeks was the norm for a good transatlantic crossing. 6 people to a berth, sleeping beside strangers, no privacy, locked below decks during storms. For someone who had never sailed on a ship before and possibly couldn't swim, this 6-week crossing must have been terrifying. Imagine stretching the food rations you brought with you out over 7 weeks or more because of a delay leaving the port or because of bad weather. How would you look when you arrived at your destination? When these immigrants arrived in the port of New York, they must have felt such an overwhelming sense of relief. They'd made it. The harbour, then called the Narrows, had Manhattan on one side in green and Staten Island on the other in red. Ships often stayed in the harbour for 2 weeks or more, waiting medical inspection. The blue line represents the 5.2 miles of water that separated the quarantine station on Staten Island from Manhattan. The Marine Hospital and Quarantine Station was well designed, but in 1847, when a disease with a mortality rate of 11% hit New York, the quarantine station was severely tested. The disease was typhus, but because of that anti-Irish sentiment, it was called Irish fever. I don't think they called it that in Boston, and I don't think they called it ship fever in Grosse Ile, but in New York, it was called Irish fever. Spanish flu in 1918 had a mortality rate of 10 to 20%, and in 2022, people aged between 20 to 40 who got COVID had a mortality rate of less than 1%. So it's right there in the middle of all of this. 11% is pretty high for that typhus epidemic in 1847. So for comparison purposes, Irish immigrants arriving on Staten Island faced a short ferry ride with only 5.2 miles of water separating the quarantine from Manhattan. New York was densely populated, and Staten Island's population had also increased, massive amounts of buildings. Within 30 minutes, Irish immigrants would be taken from the ships, provided they had passed medical inspection, and brought into the city of New York. The journey from Grosse Ile to Quebec City was much longer. To reach Grosse Ile today, you must take a 45-minute car ride from Quebec to Berthier-sur-Mer, and then a 45-minute ferry ride from Berthier-sur-Mer to Grosse Ile, the island in the middle of the St. Lawrence. Walking from Berthier-sur-Mer to Quebec would take about 9.5 hours. So it's still not far enough away, because yet in 1847, typhus still made its way into Quebec City. And of course, Deer Island in Boston was also a quarantine built in 1847 and was also used to isolate sick immigrants from the famine. It was only a 7-mile walk to the city centre of Boston, but they couldn't walk it because it's called Deer Island because at low tide, the deer would walk to the island and back. There's now a bridge. Therefore, it's important to remember how close these quarantines were to local communities. And in the case of Staten Island, it wasn't just close to the community, it was in the town of Tompkinsville, which is called St. George today. I was so thin, I was a mere living skeleton. This is what William Smith said in 1848 when he arrived at Staten Island quarantine. Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper shows a sketch of US soldiers left unaided at the end of the US Civil War in 1865. Now, this would be a more accurate depiction of how most Irish famine immigrants looked upon their arrival in the port of New York. Because a lot of Irishmen did fight in the US Civil War, Frank Leslie's illustration might actually be of Irish men born in Ireland during the famine or before. We'll return to William Smith shortly. First, I want to introduce you to this Roscommon man. His name is James Irwin. And this man met Irish famine immigrants when they arrived in the port of New York. He was the outdoor quarantine agent for the Irish Immigrant Society. Before we talk more about him, I want you to meet another County Roscommon man. This is Gregory Dillon, and he was the president of the Irish Immigrant Society. He started up the Irish Immigrant Society to assist in settling newly arrived Irish immigrants in New York. Runners, have you seen The Gangs of New York? And I can never remember her name, the blonde actress. She was the thief in The Gangs of New York that stole Cameron Diaz. She is a thief. If you remember The Gangs of New York, it's accurate. It's actually very accurate because she speaks with an Irish accent. He trusts her because he's Irish too. And then she absconds with his watch, and she is a runner. And there were runners with Irish accents in New York at the time. They lured newly arrived immigrants to lodging houses only to rob them blind. In response to growing concerns about the spread of diseases such as typhus and now cholera in the early 1850s, Dillon started the Commissioners of Immigration in 1852. And he said the object and end of that organisation was to protect the immigrant more perfectly in all that relates to supplying their wants on arrival. So there were efforts already in New York to help the Irish immigrants arriving into that city. The sketch on is of the original location of the Irish Immigrant Society, which Dillon started. It eventually became the Irish Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank. This bank often helped Irish immigrants send money home to assist relatives, either by letting them buy food or buy a passage back out to America. Dillon was president of the Irish Immigrant Society and then the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank. The bank's opening in 1850 coincided with the waves of Irish immigrants that followed in the wake of the Irish famine and remains a great source of information about Irish famine immigrants who used the bank, representing only 5% of Irish famine immigrants in New York. So it is online. If you are wondering if maybe your famine ancestor is in that database, email me, I'll send you the link to it. But again, the amazing thing is there are thousands of them in that database, and it shows you where they worked. He has done, Tyler Anbinder is a professor down in Washington University, and he has done amazing amounts of research. He has followed them as far as he can into, I think, the 1910, 1920 census. But again, they're only 5%. These depositors in this bank only represent 5% of Irish famine immigrants in 1850 to 1858. You can see here that in the years of opening its doors, the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank did quite well. Most of these depositors are Irish famine immigrants, and here is a sketch from March the 13th. You can see there within a few years it grew quite quickly. And here's a sketch from March the 13th in 1880 inside the original Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank, so it's 1880. The caption is, New York City, Irish depositors of the Immigrant Savings Bank withdrawing money to send to their suffering relatives in the old country. So now it's 30 years after the famine, and they're still suffering in Ireland. Here's a photo of one of the actual ledgers from that bank records. It's called a test book page, and it lists depositors and key information about the person opening the account. Why is it important? The questions that clerks in the bank asked depositors served a specific purpose. The answers acted like today's passwords, and only those who knew the answers could access the account. For example, it becomes like a trail of breadcrumbs. The answers that these depositors gave are a treasure trove of information about Irish depositors during the Irish Famine. The first picture there is the EISB, the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank record, and it tells us that depositor number 3008, Patrick Barry, arrived on the ship Argyle, and the date he arrived into the port of New York. And he lists his job as a gardener in the quarantine station. Number 2, we have the ship's manifest of the Argyle on the day that he arrived, and he also is mentioned in the 1860 census, his wife and their 4 children. Up until 1880, Patrick Barry is still living on Staten Island, and he's still a gardener, but his first job was as a gardener in the quarantine station. So I'll quickly talk about the history of quarantine stations in New York. During Ireland's Great Hunger of 1845 to 52, the city had already experienced a yellow fever epidemic in 1798 and a resurgence of yellow fever in 1803, which killed more than 600 people. The first quarantine station to deal with that crisis was located at Governor's Island, and it opened in 1794. In 1799, the quarantine station on Governor's Island was relocated to Tompkinsville, St. George, and Staten Island. New York's first health officer in the quarantine station was Richard Bailey, and he was born in Fairfield, Connecticut. Richard Bailey died 2 years later, 2 years after the quarantine opened in Tompkinsville. He died of yellow fever in 1801. So the head doctor died of yellow fever. Present-day St. George was then called Tompkinsville, and it was a beautiful, bucolic countryside. It was chosen for the site of the Marine Hospital and Quarantine Station because of that 5.2 miles of water called the Narrows, which meant it was close enough to deliver goods to an expanding and developing New York, but it was also far enough away, they thought, to keep diseased immigrants on Staten Island. But the community living on Staten Island never wanted the quarantine there. In other words, it was an efficient port, but the location didn't please everybody, and there was good reason for that. Historian Catherine Stevenson describes the buildings on the 30-acre lot. St. Nicholas Hospital was the quarantine's most prominent and impressive building. Nearly 300 feet long and 50 feet wide, St. Nicholas was capped by an observatory adorned with a statue of a sailor. The hospital looked out over a large garden that sloped down toward the water, and on each story there were piazzas. The smallpox hospital, one of the oldest structures on the ground, had 6 patient wards. The female hospital was a 2-story building fronting the bay. To the north of the grounds were several buildings owned by the federal government and used by U.S. Harbour inspectors, while to the south there were several wooden houses where the doctors lived. Some smaller wooden buildings held offices. The boatmen who carried passengers from their ships to the hospitals lived in 6 brick houses, while 8 wooden story shanties housed patients and many stevedores who unloaded cargo from the boats. Other buildings included stables, barns, coal houses, wash houses, and storerooms. And historian John H. Fahey describes it as follows: 3 prominent brick hospitals, a long 3-story fever hospital, was situated near the hospital and had porches and verandas from which patients could enjoy the fresh air. I'll ask you to remember that now, because that's actually going to come into play again at the end of this. So there's verandas where patients can sit and enjoy and take in the fresh air. Another large 3-story yellow fever hospital had a prominent cupola capped with the statue of a sailor looking out to sea, a reminder that this had been the original Marine Hospital, and further up the hill sat a smaller smallpox hospital. So up until 1845, it did what it was designed to do. It was a quarantine, it was a hospital, it was a marine hospital, and it was designed beautifully and, as I said, did what it was supposed to do: quarantine the sick. But William Smith provides the most accurate account of the medical inspection process and life inside Staten Island's quarantine. For comparison purposes, and because there are no photographs of the Irish who were starving, photography wasn't invented till 1838, and it was a new technology. Only the rich could afford it, and who hangs a sad picture over their mantelpiece? This is a photograph of the victims of the Madras famine in 1877. Smith tells us that when he arrived in the quarantine in Staten Island, I was a mere living skeleton. Smith was not an Irishman, he was a Manchester weaver who sailed from Liverpool to New York during the winter of 1847 to 48. His book, An Immigrant's Narrative, or A Voice from Steerage, if you're interested, it's online. Email me, I'll send it to you. Being a brief account of the sufferings of the immigrants in the ship India on her voyage from Liverpool to New York in the winter of 1847, together with a statement of the cruelties practiced upon the immigrants in the Staten Island hospital. Now, maybe Smith embellished his time in the quarantine, making it sound worse than it was, but it was similar to another book by Robert White, The Ocean Plague, A Voyage to Quebec in an Irish immigrant vessel, written after White's voyage to Quebec in 1847. William Smith wrote his book in 1850, but Robert White wrote The Ocean Plague in 1848. They're almost identical, but again, the Smith book is very important because it's the only account now that we have of what life was like inside the Staten Island Marine Hospital and quarantine station. You can see there that that's an actual newspaper account of the ship India. Captain Ward of the Seventh Ward reports that there is now no person on board this vessel except the night watch. On Friday, a small boy who was on board was complaining of being ill when the health officer came back and took him away. So there's a reason why they're inspecting this vessel, to make sure that everybody is off of it. Smith says, it was in the depth of winter when we landed at Staten Island, and upon reaching the sick room, I was immediately undressed, put into a hot bath, and then carried into what they called a bed. I had not been many minutes in it before I began to feel cold. The room was a very long one, containing a great number of beds. At one end of the room was a stove. The pipe attached to it is extended to the other end for the purpose of heating it. The bed I was in, being a long distance from the stove and too far away from the pipe to feel any heat from either, the feeling of coldness increased till, in the course of a half an hour, I was trembling violently, and notwithstanding every effort, I could not keep my teeth from striking each other. He goes on to describe the bed he's lying on. The bedposts were made of iron, with iron bars for the bottom, similar to wooden lats. Upon these bars was put a coarse fabric containing a little straw. This they called a bed. While lying upon it, I felt the bars almost as distinctly as though there was no bed under me. I was so thin, I was a mere living skeleton. That's actually the Irish Workhouse Centre in Portumna. That is the hometown where I grew up, and it's also going to be the National Irish Famine Commemoration Day location on May the 17th, 2026. So guess where I'll be in May? He says, if I were to give every instance of cruelty practiced upon the poor immigrants during my stay in that hospital, I might fill a volume, but it is impossible for me to remember a 10th part of what I saw there. There were 2 rows of wooden benches, one on each side of the room, and these benches were placed along the foot of the beds. Each patient is ordered to sit upon the bench, which is close to the foot of his bed. Now this is, I use the interiors of the fever sheds, they call them lazarettos, up in Gros Isle in Quebec, and the interior of the workhouse, because we're talking about the public health system during the Victorian era. So what's happening in New York is based on what they're doing in Europe effectively, and in Canada and in Britain. So it's very, very similar. Smith says, my bed in this room was like the one in the sick room, a long distance away from the fire. Every morning before I could half dress myself, my hands and fingers became so cold that I could not finish dressing, and had to get any patient I could do that favour for me. As soon as we were dressed, we were shivering with intense cold, while those whose bed was near to the stove were suffering equal hardships from the heat. So whoever's furthest away is freezing, whoever's closest to the stove is roasting, so they have to take turns. The moment the nurse, or the overseer as he was called, went out of the room, we would hurry to the stove to warm ourselves, while those who were too warm also gladly seized the opportunity to leave their seats. So this here is a map, 1845, of the quarantine grounds. The Staten Island advance letter from a citizen reflects the growing concern in the community about releasing healthy immigrants who fell sick within days of arriving, and they are now putting pressure on other health institutions, such as a hospital on Ward's Island. So we're going to read just the enlarged portion here. And has anybody ever studied Latin? Okay, so we're going to have a little test at the end of this. And they're all breaking a sweat. He says, if the latter be affirmed, how came these recently arrived and infected immigrants at Ward's Island? Why were they not detained at Staten Island Hospital until it was ascertained whether they were infected? Of what use is the quarantine sustained at so enormous an expense for the fees and salaries of the health officer, his deputies, and the physicians of the hospital on Staten Island? What are the medical officers of our Board of Health about when they have allowed these infected persons to be sent to Ward's Island, which is within the limits of the city? And it's signed by I'll give it to you. I know it. Salus Populi. Salus Populi. Anybody know what that is? Salus Populi. The people's health. Now, another little question. Who would have been educated enough in that era to actually know Latin? The doctors and the priests, right? It's a doctor who's written this. So even the doctors on Staten Island are complaining about that they just can't deal with the pressure, the numbers of immigrants coming in. They cannot accommodate them, so they're releasing them almost too quickly, some of these doctors. A little bit like what we just lived through. A person would arrive, the doctor would come on the boat to inspect them, they look healthy, they go into Manhattan, 3 days later, they're sick. And so they've spread it to everybody they've come in contact with as well. Salus Populi. So here's the map in 1848. My own labels are in green to provide a clearer description of the 30-acre site, which was enclosed by a 6-foot stone wall. You'll see that there's a cemetery. That's now a children's playground, and the northwestern burial ground, referred to today as the Northern Cemetery. Across the street, and here you have to remember this one too, is a hotel and a pub called Nautilus Hall, and it's named after the very first Staten Island ferry, the Nautilus. The owner of Nautilus Hall is a man by the name of Thomas Burns, and he would be instrumental in bringing to a head the 50-plus year battle between the locals opposed to and the authorities in favour of the location of the quarantine on that fateful Wednesday night in September of 1858, when the entire facility was burned to the ground. So really, you'd have to stand on the property, the 30-acre site, to realise how large it is. Where that the mass grave in front of the courthouse, I had to put that in there because for years I thought that where I was going for Irish Famine Commemoration Day is where it says cemetery, but it's not. That cemetery is now a children's playground, where I have been going on Staten Island in front of the St. George Courthouse, is this almost perfect hill, and that's where they're buried. So it wasn't designed as a cemetery. They had to bury them hastily in trench burial style.
Was it burned intentionally?
We'll get to that. And that's why I always feel like as if I have to be fair to the locals and give both sides of the story there, because when you start to dive this deep into history, I don't know which side I'd have fallen on. So we'll get there. So this was sketched in the year of 1858. It's the same year that the Staten Island Marine Hospital was burned. So it looks quite nice. It's designed quite well. If you remember that map with the green labels, there's even a fish pond on this 30-acre site. Now let's return to this man, James Irwin from Roscommon, the outdoor quarantine agent for the quarantine from 1846 to 1858. He arrived in New York on July 30th, 1845, just 6 or 7 weeks before the famine, the Blight arrived in Ireland. He may not have experienced the famine in Ireland, but little did he know how bad things would become on Staten Island and New York because of it. Notice the dates of the arrival of the first famine ships, right at the start of Irwin's career as a quarantine agent. The first of the famine ships began appearing in New York during the fall and the winter of 1846. In January 1847, over 4,000 immigrants arrived at the quarantine. This figure was far above the number seen in any of the previous winters. As the historian John Duffy indicates, although the 3 quarantine hospitals had only 850 beds, during one 9-month period, the admissions totaled 7,000 patients, forcing the construction of haphazard shanties and mass graves, the one I just showed you, at the quarantine. Many immigrants who made it out of quarantine after their initial exam fell sick soon afterward and were admitted to the city's hospitals like on Ward's Island and almhouses, taxing those facilities as well. The death rate from typhus or ship fever or Irish fever throughout the city reached epidemic proportions. So here we have a description of an Irish family who arrived in New York in February 28, 1847. While Liverpool, Manchester and all the great cities of England are overwhelmed by the hundreds of thousands of starving Irish, our streets are by no means free of these unfortunates. Officer Logan of the 2nd Ward Police found a man, his wife and 11 children, passengers in the John R. Skiddy, in the streets yesterday entirely destitute and in a miserable plight. They were promptly taken to the station house and provisions were sent to them by Mrs. Clark. So now please remember that some of these people have cleared medical inspection and will fall sick days later in the city, possibly infecting everyone else they're coming in contact with. There are actually accounts of patients in the quarantine climbing over that 6-foot wall to go out and have a drink in the locality or meet their relatives. Returning to the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank, and this is why the comments recorded by the clerks are important. I want to read to you a comment written by one of the bank tellers about a man who has just walked in to open an account and deposit his money. And the clerk writes down, Thomas O'Rourke was sick with fever in the quarantine. So this man had been sick or was still sick and left the quarantine to open an account in the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank. There were 191 passengers on his ship, the Industry. And they called the quarantines barriers against invisible foes. Before there were actual buildings that were quarantines, ships were the quarantines. Historian John H. Fahey again describes what Irwin, the outdoor immigration agent, and others working in the quarantine witnessed from 1847 to 1858. He says the sweet smell of sickness hung over the compound. Emaciated men and women lay on the ground outside hastily constructed and already overcrowded temporary hospitals. A pier had been extended out to the passenger dock to make it easier to carry patients ashore. Recently dug burial trenches lined the northwest corner of the compound to handle the hundreds of dead from what has become known as Black 47. And notice the mention of burial trenches in the northwest compound. People are dying in the quarantine so quickly in 1847 and 48, and in such large numbers, the staff are now burying them in an area of the quarantine that is not the cemetery mentioned on the map. It is called the Western Burial Grounds, which today is in front of the St. George Courthouse. And now we'll get to your question about the destruction of the quarantine. Remember that Nautilus Hall was directly across the street from the wall grounds of the site. Thomas Burns, owner of Nautilus Hall, and other volunteer firefighters, he was the head of the fire department, burned the station at the Staten Island Marine Hospital and Quarantine Station to the ground on the night of September 1st, 1858. It also happened to be the same night that New York City held a firework display celebrating the laying of the transatlantic cable, and maybe that night was deliberately chosen because the fireworks would be a distraction when the quarantine was burning. Using coded language, such as Save Dr. Thompson's house, which really meant burn it, Burns and others destroyed the entire grounds. Firemen claimed their hoses had been cut and said the assault on the harbour police force with rocks prevented them from helping. Nothing could be done to save the structures from burning to the ground. All it took was some deliberately placed straw, camphene and matches. Patients were dragged from their beds and laid on the grass beneath the stars to watch as the Staten Island Marine Hospital and Quarantine Station burned. One person died by accident, one person was shot, but the patients had been taken out of the beds, so they at least saved the patients. What destruction wasn't fully achieved on the night of September 1st, the locals returned to finish the job on September 2nd. The police showed up on September 3rd, and nothing but embers remained. Notice how the area around the quarantine has built up since it first opened in 1799. It is no longer a countryside, it is no longer bucolic, it has become congested. Staff working in the quarantine were reportedly coming and going without any restrictions. There were reports of patients climbing over the walls and going into town, death carts in the streets overloaded with bodies, and covert burials at night. If you remember, the Northern Cemetery was within the quarantine wall grounds and not an ideal location for a cemetery. So it was never designated as a cemetery. It was response to immigrants dying so quickly that they didn't know where else to bury them.
So who were the people that burned the hospital?
So some of them were actually of Irish descent. They were paid to do it. So there are accounts that there seemed to be a division between the Irish that had been settled in the area for a long time before, resented these impoverished Irish coming in. But do we know it for definite? I've heard a couple of people tell me that now, you know. So yeah, we'll never know really. There's a couple of people that are, you know, have to testify in to the assembly in New York. You'll see their names and you'll see their accounts as well in a few minutes. But people have told me that some of the people that actually assisted in burning down the quarantine were earlier Irish settlers. By September the 11th, nothing but ruins remained, and therefore all records were lost. The EISB records can reveal the names of Irish immigrants who worked at the Staten Island Marine Hospital and Quarantine. I actually have gone through the entire, there's something like 10,000. I've gone through the entire database and I found about 50 plus Irish Famine immigrants who worked as washerwomen, gardeners, worked in the soup kitchen, and actually grave diggers in the quarantine, and they were born in Ireland. So I'll come back and share that with you. As author Robert Evans says, there are three sides to every story: your side, my side, and the truth. And no one is lying. Memories shared serve each other differently. So 10 years earlier, on December the 26th, 1848, the Committee of the Legislature of New York mentioned the population growth on Staten Island in their report and recommended that the quarantine be removed. So the law's on their side. 10 years earlier, 1848, they said that the quarantine is going to be removed. The quarantine establishment should be removed, it says, from its present location on the eastern shore of Staten Island for the following reasons. Both the eastern and northern sides of the island must now be considered suburbs of the city of New York. The residences of merchants and persons of other occupations together with the workshops and factories of the mechanics doing business for and daily in New York, surround the hospitals and are only separated by the width of a street bounded by a brick wall. On January the 29th, 1849, 21 citizens of Castleton in the area of Tompkinsville tested before the Castleton Board of Health about how the location of the quarantine in Staten Island had adversely affected their lives. Notice that Buchanan says he moved to the area in the beginning of June 1848. That move, as it turns out, was bad timing on his part, and Buchanan states to the Board of Health, the walls of the establishment are not sufficient height to keep persons from going in or out. Dawson, in this document, says that the stench was worse from the burial grounds about the time the burial trench was opened in June of 1847, Black 47. There is even testimony that the piazzas, those verandas where the patients sit out and take the fresh air, are so close to the windows of Nautilus Hall that the residents in Nautilus Hall can see into the hospital rooms and see the chamber pots beneath the patients' beds. So the locals too are under the threat of infection. In fact, Tompkinsville shut down and people vacated their homes, businesses and premises for a few months in 1848, and they did not return to their homes and businesses until the first frost. And this shutdown would have impacted Buchanan's move to Tompkinsville in 1848. So things are so bad in 1848, they're afraid that the hot weather is going to make things worse, and they move out of where they live and wait for the first frost. The law was on their side, but nothing was being done. The House of Assembly appointed a select committee on the 11th of April 1848, again 10 years before the burning of the quarantine, and they compiled this Assembly document number 60, which was published in 1849. It states, the quarantine established has become not only more dangerous in the health of the neighbourhood, but the offensive effluvia and disgusting exhibitions complained of, the greater amount of disease concentrated there, has not only rendered the establishment more noxious than heretofore, but has rendered it a much greater degree a continuous source of annoyance and discomfort, and has rendered the enjoyment of life and property much more uncomfortable, and that for these reasons the residents have good cause of complaint and have good right to ask to be relieved from this annoyance and discomfort. They believed that the air contained disease particles, so they were always talking about the miasma, M-I-A-S-M-A. Now remember, the law was on their side of the locals protesting the quarantine's location, and those locals included doctors, Salus Populi, residents and merchants in Tompkinsville, but did the law to protect them. It's 1856, so that's the ruins of the hospital. Those pillars that you see there, they were actually used on a gateway in one of the larger cemeteries in Staten Island, and then it disappeared. So there's nothing left. It's 1856, and a ship called the Rattler is infected and has been allowed to go to New York again. It resulted in several yellow fever cases on board, and the mayor of New York threatened to sink it unless it was removed, and so it was brought to a densely populated area near the Staten Island Ferry Landing. The Board of Health in Castleton linked many yellow fever cases to mismanagement at the quarantine institution. About 26 cases and 10 deaths were reported early in the season. So day after day, they witnessed their fellow citizens falling ill and dying. This is 1856, 2 years before they decide to take action. Eight years after the burning of the quarantine, handling sick immigrants is still an issue. So you can see, I'll go back to that one. Harper's Weekly discusses the arrival of cholera at the port of New York in that same year, and the city's unpreparedness to handle this new disease and this potentially new epidemic. The article mentions approximately 2,000 people were detained in quarantine with limited hospital accommodations on the Falcon and another steamship, Illinois, for well passengers, while other infected ships were expected. Now take a look at where the quarantine still is in 1866. Again, this is now, we are 8 years after the burning to the ground of the quarantine, and ships, sick immigrants, are still being docked right off of Staten Island. So Irish bronze artist Rowan Gillespie was on site in 2001, I believe. And these are the immigrants he envisions when the horrendous situation of Irish famine immigrants arriving in Staten Island during the years of 1847 to 1852. As I said, he was on site in 2003 when he learned that the northwestern burial ground was being excavated. And the fact that we don't know the names of thousands of Irish famine victims buried there befits the title of his sculpture. They are merely statistics. This sculpture is part of the Great Hunger collection currently. It will be on display in Norwalk at the Lockwood Matthews Mansion starting on March the 12th, I believe. The statues are standing on a table, and there are 650 names inscribed on the tables. The 650 names are the only names we have of the people that died on Staten Island during the quarantine, and they come from the Richmond County mortality schedule of 1850. It lists the names, their age at death, and the disease that the person died from. As Gillespie notes at the end of his artist statement, thousands more of these famine victims are buried in the Northern Cemetery, now a memorial green whose upkeep is done by Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries, and Lynn Rogers heads that organisation. Silver Lake Cemetery on Staten Island also has Irish famine immigrants buried there. It isn't the first time in 2003 when workers walk off the job when they're rebuilding, doing construction work for the courthouse, and they discover bones. In 2003, the workers walk off the job. That's not the first time that human remains were found on the site. The Staten Island Advance in 1957 has an account of a woman, a local, who follows a dump truck to the Staten Island Ferry and watches soil and skeletal remains being dropped into the water. And she knew, that lady knew, that it was actually a famine burial ground. On Staten Island, a simple famine marker in front of the St. George Courthouse marks where the immigrants are buried with haste. The perfectly formed hill in front of the courthouse is spectacular, even more so when you realise what it is, a mass grave. This is the famine marker and the Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries of Staten Island sign marking the memorial green. It says, "Final resting place for thousands of Irish immigrants who died and were buried here between 1845 and 1858. Perhaps not all of them are Irish, but given the location of the cemetery and the year it was cut, and the year it ceased to accept burials, the majority are Irish. DNA testing on the 83 skeletal remains exhumed and then reburied in the 2 coffins mentions Celtic origin because of soft teeth." So we always think, DNA evolves so quickly, but back in 2003, it's not as great as it is now, and they use this DNA testing by an archaeologist that says because they have these skeletal remains of soft teeth, they are from Celtic origins. The history of the Staten Island Marine Hospital and Quarantine Station is fascinating because it is complicated. Who knows how any of us would have acted if our loved ones were dying from starvation or infectious diseases? How would I have behaved if the beautiful countryside where I live was transformed into a factoryville and quarantine in less than 50 years? I think author Martin Melosi sums it up best in his book, Fresh Kills: History of Consuming and Discarding in New York City. He says there is an eerie similarity between using the islands as a dumping ground for troubled and undesirable people and using some of the islands as a disposal site for waste. Thank you.
Thank you for one of the most compelling accounts I've ever heard of.
Thank you.
On the war. And I've listened to a lot of them, and this was truly chilling. One positive thing to come out of this mess, and I don't know if one thing would make any difference, but you had Deer Island in Boston Harbor.
Yes.
And one of the families that got there in 1847 was named McCarthy. There were about 7 of them, and everyone died except 2 of the kids.
I read about this man. Was he Providence's mayor?
He became mayor of Providence, the only immigrant mayor ever. And on his tombstone, St. Francis in Pawtucket, there's a long inscription that he wrote, basically beseeching all Irish Americans to never forget their history, their contributions, and the suffering they went through to get here. So it's a nice ending that somebody never let it go.
I'm fascinated with, traumatic memories. And that man McCarthy, when I was reading about him, I thought how sad it was for him. The way he found out that his mother was dead, he saw another woman hanging her dress on the line. Now, the other fascinating thing about this is, so Staten Island burned to the ground and the records are gone, okay? I'm fascinated with the Immigrant Industrial Savings Bank because that has some of the mentions in it of people working in the quarantine, as I'd said, but also those assembly documents where the locals are complaining about, and it is a very complicated history, and that makes it even more fascinating. But what I find fascinating about Deer Island in comparison to Staten Island is that Deer Island still had all of the materials, the records. And James McColgan up in Boston told me this. I met with him in the summer. So in 1995, on the 150th anniversary, and it's amazing about collective memory, and this is why, like you said, it's important for us to sit, talk, share, and make sure that the younger generation also get involved, is we forget. In Deer Island, Jim McColgan told me that in 1995, they stood on the 150th anniversary of the famine at a grave site, a mass grave. And even though Deer Island had all the records, in the middle of the mass, standing around that grave site, he realized that's not where the famine immigrants were buried. That's what was it called? It was where the prisoners were buried. And now Jim and I are in contact with one another to find out where is the site? Where are the famine immigrants buried? Whereas in Staten Island, we know where they're buried, but we have no records. So it's still important that we know they're there. I'll share the history with as many people, and then I'll pass the torch to you, and you go tell somebody else. And that's how we don't forget. I am not proprietary about this. I am not territorial. I want people to know. Yep.
Yeah, about 10 years ago, Amy and I went up to Quebec, and we went back across the river and drove out about maybe a half an hour, took a ferry out to Grosse Isle. And it's the story that you told tonight is their story.
Yeah.
Only Grosse Isle's about several miles away from Quebec City, and that wasn't quarantine. You went no further until you played quarantine in Grosse Isle. But what I wanted to ask is, they told us on that trip, Dawson's told us that the people, it was so bad on Staten Island in New York, that one of the methods they used to try and stop it was to raise the prices that they were charging the boats to
Yes.
land and
Yeah.
drop them off.
Yeah.
And that it was cheaper, it became much cheaper for people to go to Liverpool and from Liverpool to Grosse Isle.
I believe it was called a head tax.
Yeah.
It was called a
right.
head tax. So immigrants coming in, I think it was like $1 or something, a head tax. So you had to save a lot of money to get into the port of New York. And also, New York wasn't ruled by England. England or Canada was. So a lot of the timber being shipped back and forth. There's a fantastic book by a man called Keane T. McMahon called The Coffin Ships. And it's all about the ships going back and forth from Canada. Now some people say, well, no, he can't be right. He says that the percentage of deaths on the coffin ships might possibly be lower than what we thought. So again, what's wrong with looking at new knowledge like that and saying, okay, what were the percentages? How many people did survive? Also, another fascinating thing from the famine that I think we need to look into is the rise of crime in Ireland during the famine. And there was a rise in crime. There was something I wanted to talk to you about there. Yes. So this is what I love when you have, you think all these facilities are operating independently of one another. When I was up talking to Jim McColgan in Boston, he mentioned to me this Dr. Upham, who was in Deer Island. And the amazing thing is, Dr. Upham has written a book. Email me, I'll send you the digital file. And what he was doing was, it sounds terrible now, but it was cutting edge scientific thinking at the time. We're talking about when the immigrants would go into Boston and 3 days later come back to Deer Island quarantine because they felt sick. And what he was doing was, he was doing autopsies on these patients when they died and looking at their colon to see what the color was, and then going back down to Staten Island to tell the doctors in Staten Island, if the colon is brown, it means that they're probably going to survive, and blah, blah, blah. Look for these symptoms, when they're alive, and things like that. So these doctors, it's also, a time when they're learning, unfortunately, but it's a time when there's scientific expansion and thinking about the human body. Any more questions?
Yeah, I'd like to ask, going back to the famine itself and, the evolution of thinking and study on it. What is your feeling about it being described as a genocide in today's language?
That's a great question, Jim. That's a great question. I guess the UN Charter describes genocide as having machinery with the intent to kill. So what I would ask you is, what's the definition of machinery? Are laws machinery? Is neglect machinery? I don't know. I don't know. I will say that those two misguided principles of providentialism and that Malthusian Thomas Malthus economic ideology of laissez-faire, they didn't help, and they really helped each other. It just kind of was a happy coincidence at the time that England was doing better because of these two ideologies, while Ireland suffered. So I don't know. Does that answer your question?
No. But thank you for that information.
The Irish who emigrated to England, during that period, how well did they do?
Another good question. In Liverpool, there's a famine memorial in Liverpool. I do know that, and it took them a while, certainly, to get. I'm sure that they also faced anti-Irish sentiment in Liverpool. There was a podcast, if you're into podcasts, that actually did like a mockumentary, if you will, of new journalists, like that they were existing in the time of Irish famine immigrants arriving in Liverpool, and you suddenly realize what they're describing is a refugee crisis, which makes it very relevant. So it's fascinating. Yes, I think that they suffer greatly. I really do.
When we were in 1990, that we were told that the immigrants were treated more compassionately there than in the United States because of the shared religions. Is that accurate?
I think the religion would have had something to do with it, but I also know that they were looking for people to populate Canada. And if you've been to Roseal, I remember that photo when I was there 2 years ago. I've come to Canada, and the corn is as high as your ear, and next thing you realize it's just pure propaganda, that the people are kneeling down in the fields and the corn is just right up here. So I mean, they needed people to work the land, same as Australia. Another thing that came out of the famine, of course, is the famine orphans and the Earl Grey scheme. So yeah, lots of ramifications. Any more questions? Yeah.
I
may have misheard you, but did you say something about the landowners assisted immigration?
Assisted immigration, yeah. Nice way of saying, you know, if you knock down your cottage, we'll pay you and we'll give you the money to get on the ship. Because it was cheaper. You see, the landlords were paying the poor relief tax as well. Is that the tax it's called? Which meant that they had to pay for the upkeep and running of the workhouses. And in some cases, it would have been cheaper to pay for the people to emigrate and to turn from crop farming to animal farming, like raising cows and raising pigs, right? Because you needed less intensive human labor. So it made sense if you're going to pay for people to emigrate so that your land could yield more of a profit instead of paying for a workhouse. So they called it assisted immigration. There's quite a few landlords around the country who help do that. One of the most famous, the National Famine Museum in Roscommon. I can't think of the town. My grandfather was from Atleague. It's near Atleague. He actually sent 170 people off of his land and they had to walk to the port in Dublin. But there's also another famous one called the Collatin Estate Evictions, and it's called, the man who wrote that book is Jim Rees, and it's called Surplus People. Surplus People. Too many people, cheaper to pay their fares and send them off to Canada, which was the cheapest route, and then instead of growing wheat and barley, we'll just raise cattle because they make more money and it's less labor intensive. Okay. I'll finish up now and say there's just a few little fact sheets here if you want to look at pictures, hold them in your hands. There's actually a list of the names of the 650 people that are on the statues by Rowan Gillespie, that he is. So if you're curious to see if maybe somebody that you've been looking for on Ancestry.com that came over with your great-great-great-grandmother and you know that they were in the quarantine or got sick, maybe you found them. And also I brought sign-up sheets for Ireland's Great Hunger Museum of Fairfield, which I'm a part of, and I look forward to seeing you in 2027 when we all get together here for Irish Famine Commemoration Day. How does that sound?
Very good.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.